Sir.
From the Matrix Home Solutions studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy and Dr. Tony Fauci on with one of the acceptable hosts that will do nothing but fawn over him and agree with him. So that's where he spends most of his time as a TV doctor today, these days, I should say. And yesterday it was with Oprah's BFF, Gayle King, talking Delta variant.
Well, the concern is, first of all, the virus itself can transmit much more readily from person to person. We know that from experience in our own country as well as in several other countries. So you're dealing with a real bad actor virus. The issue is, given the number of people in the country who are not vaccinated, that really is the concern, because the vaccines that we have available that we are administering throughout the country do very well against the Delta variant, particularly protecting against severe disease leading to hospitalization.
Mm-hmm. And he went on to say these, essentially, he didn't use this term, but these COVID ambassadors that we were talking about yesterday, the scripts that are being prepared in places like Lake County, Illinois.
And you and I did a wonderful on-air read of that, by the way.
No, there's no question.
I think we're going to get a daytime Emmy for our work.
Or perhaps a side hustle as a COVID ambassador, COVID vaccine ambassador. He referenced how important those are. And then, of course, Gayle King chimed in to be so agreeable, like over-the-top agreeable. Like, she is so strident on this issue that unvaccinated family, they're not invited for the holidays.
Dr. Fauci, I don't know how many more times you can say to people, listen, it will save your life. I have this problem with some members of my own family, which I'm now going to ban for Thanksgiving vacation. That's how strongly I'm taking what you're saying.
You are such a hero.
You can't come to my house on a day of Thanksgiving when we love to be with family members. Shame on her.
Gayle King is
oh my gosh, such a hero. She's so awesome.
Such a positive example of COVID leadership. And apparently the vaccine comes with a frontal lobotomy. For more on the topic, pleased to be joined by Dr. Joel Zinberg, Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in D.C. and Associate Clinical Professor of Surgery at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Dr. Zinberg, you heard what Tony Fauci said about the Delta variant, why he's so concerned about it, and yet you wrote a piece that we're supposed to stop panicking about Delta. Tell us where Tony Fauci has gone awry.
Well, I don't know that Tony, good morning, by the way. I don't know that Tony Fauci has gone awry so much as he's warning that this is more transmissible. And if you are unvaccinated, you stand a higher chance of being infected and then becoming ill, all of which is true. But the good news, of course, is that the vaccines that we have work against the virus. We have very high rates of vaccination in this country, and most importantly, in the most vulnerable population, the people over age 65, 9 in 10 have gotten at least one dose, which is highly effective in stopping transmission, and 4 out of 5 people in that age group have gotten the full vaccination regime. Mm-hmm. So they are very well protected. And even in the rare cases where vaccine fails and you get an infection, it's very clear from the data that being vaccinated makes you have a less severe and shorter case of illness. And it also lowers the number of viruses that you have so that you're less of a threat to others.
I mean, I can't say this enough. I know this gets redundant, but you have to, I guess, address redundancies with redundancies. The problem I have with Tony Fauci, one of the many problems, is that he doesn't make those distinctions that you just made in the conversation.
Yeah, he scares us instead.
It is everybody. He continues the way he talks in vague generalizations. Is everybody is in the same boat, and that's not true.
Well, I mean, there's a bit of a scolding tone to some of the things he says.
Yes, at minimum. Oh, by the way, there's also, I mean, again, all this context that turns out to be important. So you talked about the high vaccination rates, particularly for those in the most vulnerable category, plus those who've gotten sick and survived, plus, which is 99,900 plus people who caught COVID from the UK, U.S., Germany, Italy, Israel, Singapore. Half of them in the first group had gotten the flu jab between 2 to 6 weeks before the COVID diagnosis. The second group had not been vaccinated against the flu. Those who had not had the flu jab were up to 20% more likely to have been admitted to an ICU with COVID, and more like 58% more likely to visit the emergency room and so forth. The basic top-line takeaway from this research is that flu jabs could slash risk of severe COVID by upwards of 60%.
Well, look, you have to, there's a good deal of overlap in the symptoms of COVID and influenza. So sometimes it can be hard to distinguish what the person is really sick with. And that's been a problem from the start. People who have other illnesses and go on to die that are also happen to have COVID, everyone attributes the death to COVID. Whereas, in fact, if you were in a motorcycle accident and you happen to have COVID, it's a pretty good chance that COVID didn't cause your death.
Yeah, but they'll put them down as a COVID death.
In some instances, yes, they will, and that's been a problem from the start.
Well, because money's attached to it, too.
But even a bigger point is this, which is this idea that we could have another COVID rampage through the population that piles up any sort of similar death toll to the one piled up over the last year plus. There's just no basis to believe that, is there?
No, look, the bottom line is this. The Delta variant is now the dominant strain in this country and in many others around the world. It's more transmissible than the earlier variants. However, we have a large percentage of our population vaccinated. We vaccinated the most vulnerable people. The people who remain at risk are those who are unvaccinated, and particularly those people who have underlying medical conditions. But you're not talking about a large percentage of the population anymore. Between vaccine immunity and natural immunity from recovery from an earlier COVID infection, you're probably very close to what's needed for or at herd immunity. So it's not. Even though we've seen an uptick in cases, we really have not seen a big uptick or any uptick, frankly, in hospitalization. We've seen some hospitalization uptick, but no real uptick in deaths. And it's really just that the hospitalizations are now plateauing as opposed to the steady decline that we've had for the last few months. But they're plateauing at an extremely low level.
Well, then can you explain to us what's going on in Israel? Because now people with comorbidities are getting a third booster shot.
Well, I think what's happening is that to some extent they're overreacting, but the people who they're giving the third booster shots or talking about giving the third booster shots are people who have impaired immune systems, so people with cancers, people with other immunodeficiency syndromes. Those are people who they're considering giving a shot to. They're not considering giving a shot to the general population. And look, my article was basically argued that in Israel and many other countries and in some communities in this country, like L.A. County, I think they're overreacting to COVID. There's, the COVID Delta variant, at least, and that the bottom line has been and remains the same. People should get vaccinated, particularly people who have other medical problems and are at increased risk. And there's no reason to panic. The vaccines work.
Anthony Rizzo is the first baseman for the Cubs here in Chicago, and he's taken some, even though he's otherwise a beloved figure, he's taken some heat. He's a bad person now because he's not going to get vaccinated. Olympic U.S. swimmer Michael Andrew told the press corps yesterday he's going to forego vaccination prior to the Olympic Games. Are I mean, from a medical ethics perspective, Michael Andrew, Anthony Rizzo, are they bad people for not getting the vaccine?
Well, I think they're foolish people. Are they bad people? That's not really my department. They have to deal with their clergymen and others. I mean, they're bad people in this regard. If they are in a situation that places not just them but others at risk, then they have to account for that. They have to realize that this is not simply a decision they're making for themselves, it's a decision they're making from others. So, for example, people who work in medical facilities are dealing with vulnerable, compromised patients on a daily basis, and they have to consider that they have an obligation to those people because of the profession they're involved in. I can't say the same thing's true of a professional athlete unless there's something about their team situation or their participation in the Olympics that would pose a risk to others.
Well, he's a cancer survivor.
So that wait a second. So then the flu shot. So then would the same apply, and should we have the same sort of massive, relentless PR campaign to get the flu shot based on that same standard?
Well, we do have every year. The flu is
like
something
this.
that's
Nothing like
flu
this.
Has been, well, the flu has. The flu, the coronavirus involved here for COVID-19 was more dangerous than your annual flu because it's a brand new virus that humans had not encountered before, and therefore it created a more severe disease, and that's why people were so relentless about urging vaccinations. But don't be fooled. 50 to 100,000 people die every year of influenza.
I know.
But for kids, the mortality rate is lower than the flu.
For kids, yes. COVID has a lower mortality rate among youngsters than the flu does.
Well,
but we didn't mandate flu vaccinations for, certain schools.
Well, more important than that, you don't have the teachers union saying all the kids need to be vaccinated. You don't have Tony Fauci on TV all the time, everywhere, making no distinction, saying everybody has to be vaccinated. We're down to 12. I'm sure they want to go down to in utero. It's just completely different. And despite all that we know at present, there's no indication that this will stop with COVID, and there's also no indication that the flu will be treated the same way from a public health perspective and a PR perspective.
Well, there have been, for many, many years, campaigns to get people to be vaccinated against influenza. They've been a moderate success because only about half of people every year get vaccinated against influenza. So in that regard, we're doing better against COVID than we are against influenza. But, I would urge everyone to get vaccinated against influenza every year.
Well, that's fine, but I guess the question is, culturally, are we going to be, and intellectually, are we going to be consistent? So you're consistent, but I don't think that's where this is going. And I don't think we're going to be having conversations about segregating people who didn't get the flu shot like we are with respect to the COVID vaccine when it comes to airplanes and employment and schools and so forth. I don't see that coming, but I do see it with COVID because it's been completely politicized. And I regret it. I mean, Jerry Baker's piece in the Wall Street Journal, too, about how stupid political polarization based on vaccination is. And I agree with him. But it hasn't been, for the most part, people who think like I do, who've been driving this politicization. It's been TV doctors like Tony Fauci and all these cable news talking heads. And you have to present to people how we're treating one virus versus how we treat another, and how you reconcile the standards that we're setting if you want people to have confidence in the legitimacy of your professional opinions, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I don't. Look, I'm not being inconsistent.
I know you're not.
I think there are many institutions that for over the many years have required their staffs to be vaccinated against the flu. And those same institutions should be doing the same thing against COVID. So I think, that there's certainly consistency here, but what people have to understand is that COVID, for the general population, I know you made the point earlier about children, but for the general population, COVID represents a more severe disease with a greater risk of death. COVID is much more akin to a pandemic influenza. In other words, we're used to influenza every year where there's a small number of mutations and the virus is very much like previous years, so you just have to tweak the vaccines. But every 25 years or so, you get a situation where the virus has large mutations, and it's like COVID, where the virus is something relatively new to humans. So that's the situation we're in now. But you have something that's like pandemic influenza, not like seasonal annual influenza.
But I mean, the data at present still leaves us with a case fatality rate 0.005% under the age of 70.
No, that's not true.
99.995 survival rate under the age of 70.
Yeah, no, I think that's a little bit off. But it doesn't matter. There's no question that COVID has a higher fatality rate for most people than influenza does. Well, not children. Children are the exception.
Right. But
children are the exception. But for the remainder of the population, COVID appears to have probably about twice as high a mortality figure as influenza does, as standard, as annual influenza does. Pandemic influenza, you'd be much more like, and when I say pandemic influenza, I'm talking about 1918. Well, what's known as the Spanish flu, and there have been a few less severe pandemics since then. As I say, roughly once every 25 years.
Right, which the median death age of the Spanish flu is 28, and what's the median death age here?
Right. No, the median the death age here is higher than the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
Each one of these viruses, it's hard to generalize from one to the pandemic to the next because everyone's a little different.
I agree.
So the Spanish flu was unique in that it affected young, healthy people. Mm-hmm. That's not the case with COVID. COVID, more than 80% of the fatalities have been in people 65 or older, and the fatalities in people younger are almost uniformly in people who have other medical conditions.
Right.
But that still it is still more severe than annual influenza.
I understand, but this is always about that statement, and now bump it up against the policy response. And has the policy response been proportional and sensible to the extent of the threat?
Well, I'm not really sure what you're asking.
Well, I'm saying, so it's twice, let's use your baseline, twice as lethal as the seasonal flu is the pandemic, and has the policy response from lockdowns to social distancing to mask wearing to vaccinations to all of the other strictures over the last 18 months, has that been a proportional and sensible response to the threat?
No, I think that, the initial response one cannot fault simply because at the very early stages, no one knew what this disease was going to be like. But it became apparent relatively quickly that this was not a disease that affected young children particularly badly. So all the things like the school closures and the various other lockdown measures could have been lifted much more quickly than they were. And they were kept in place for a variety of reasons. I think I would agree with you in many cases they were over-responses and illogical. They weren't really following the science. They were following politics and they were following fear. It has been disproportionate, and people were not unwilling to rely on the people's common sense to avoid things. They insisted it had to be a government-mandated lockdown. But look, you're talking about individuals who think that the government is the source of everything, so that the government has to dictate all of our actions. So, I think it was disproportionate after a few months and over the past year, certainly. And particularly now that we have a situation where so many people are vaccinated, rushing to return to these lockdown and other mitigation measures, even with the Delta virus, is a disproportionate response.
He is Dr. Joel Zinberg, Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in D.C., Associate Clinical Professor of Surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Dr. Zinberg, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure thing, anytime.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey